I think we're ready to get started. Thank you for coming and joining us for this very exciting discussion about a very exciting topic. So now everybody knows that the war has begun. And all the previous speculations about Trump's tariffs, right, as a negotiation strategy has been proved in vain. He meant it, he's doing it. Currently, it is 25% of 34 billion US dollars of Chinese import, to be followed by another 16 billion. And 2 days ago, President Trump also announced another 10% for $200 billion of Chinese import to be launched at the beginning of September. So we have observed some of the Chinese reactions to this trade war so far, and roughly it can be categorized into three things. One, retaliation. China has launched its reciprocal retaliation against the American tariff and vows to retaliate to the same quantity and quality, if and when the 200 billion is tariff. The tariff on 200 billion of Chinese product will be launched. Although the caveat is China does not import even 200 billion US dollars of American products. So how that is going to work out, we will see. The second reaction is a negotiation. I think the Chinese still look for ways to negotiate a way out. On June 26th, they sent some goodwill messages by announcing further opening of Chinese market in 10 industries. And the last but not least, we know that China is also launching its own influencing campaign here in the United States and globally. Domestically, China is targeting the potential venues to influence Trump's decision. And one way that China is doing that is by targeting US farmers, especially soybean farmers, in the hope that Trump will reconsider. And internationally, China is trying to rally in support or coalition, if you will, among countries affected by Trump's trade policy. Although that campaign has not been particularly successful because European countries and Japan also have the same grievance as the United States does on the market access and forced technological transfer. So while we keep a close eye on how this trade war is evolving, one interesting issue that has not been as well examined is how the trade war affects other countries, especially America's allies. In terms of the economic implication, the tariff on the products from China could change countries' and companies' calculations about their investment and their production in China. We also know that if US and China are going to negotiate a deal, as a part of the deal, China is likely to offer things to reduce the trade deficit. And that could have a displacement effect for other countries and other allies of the United States. Like, for example, if we use semiconductor, if China is going to import more semiconductor chips from the United States, then how is that going to affect the other producers like Taiwan and Japan and South Korea? So those are some important implications for American allies that have not been examined. Then in terms of the politics, what are the political implications of the trade war for the relationship between the United States and these allies? In particular, how does changing U.S.-China relations and the trade war affects the choices or the policies of American allies? For example, mainland has been increasingly adopting coercive and bullying behaviors towards the DPP government in Taiwan. And will this trade war with the United States offer Taiwan more opportunities or bring more pressure from the mainland? And in the case of Korea, China has been using the linkage between the North Korea issue and the trade issue with the Trump administration since 2017. So now with the trade war, China's natural instinct is that it wants to use North Korea issue further to leverage against Trump's trade decision. So what are the political ramifications? So to discuss these issues today, we have two top experts and practitioners from Taiwan and from the perspective of South Korea to discuss these implications. First of all, we have Professor SHIH-CHUNG Liu from Taiwan, who is a board member of the Cross-Strait Prospect Foundation in Taiwan, which is an affiliation of the National Security Bureau. He joined the Taiwan External Trade Development Council in October 2017 as the vice chairman. Previously, he was the Deputy Secretary General of the Tainan City Government, the president and the CEO of the Taipei-based think tank, Taiwan Brain Trust, the director of International Affairs Department of the DPP, and an advisor to the Mainland Affairs Council. So a very long list of strategic positions.
Spent some time in Washington, D.C. too.
Oh, spending time.
At the Brookings, yes.
Oh, at Brookings
Yes.
with CNAPS, visiting fellow?
CNAPS, yes.
So you're a senpai, senpai to me.
No stranger to D.C. So.
Of course, no stranger to DC. So he spent 8 years in the DPP government as a senior foreign policy advisor to former President Chen Shui-bian in the presidential office from 2000 to 2006, and joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as the vice chair of the Research and Planning Committee. So Chairman Liu definitely has a vast knowledge of the economic issues, political issues, strategic issues, and we want to hear all about those from you. And after Chairman Liu gives us an enlightenment on how these trade disputes affects Taiwan, we're going to invite Choi from the Senior Director of Congressional Affairs and Trade at Korea Economic Institute of America to tell us more about how it affects South Korea and how it affects the future of the Korean Peninsula. So Choi focuses on issues pertaining to U.S.-Korea relations, South Korea's foreign and economic policy, and North Korea. He has worked on Korea-related issues for more than a decade, and he also serves as the editor for Korea's Economy and KEI's blog, The Peninsula. He was a 2012 to 2013 Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in South Korea, sponsored by the ASEAN Institute. And prior to joining KEI, Choi worked extensively on the Capitol Hill with Senator Robert Cho-Ri-Selly on issues related to foreign affairs and trade. So with these two experts, we should be able to get some very clear answers as for where we're going. And without further ado, welcome Chairman Liu, and we want your wisdom.
Well, thank you so much, Yun-Sun. There's no clear answer to this ongoing trade war yet. Hopefully we'll find the total solution. Well, thanks again for inviting me to join this very timely event. I've been discussing with Yun-Sun in the past 2 months about what is the best timing to hold this seminar. But it ends up that this is perhaps the perfect timing. So you can never tell what would happen. Again, I'm so honored to be invited to not only come back to DC but also to join the Stimson's panel and to address this issue. My current job is Vice Chairman of Taiwan External Trade Development Council, also known as TAITRA. It's a semi-government organization doing mostly trade promotion for Taiwan. We've been doing this for almost 50 years. So, of course, this issue definitely has a huge impact on Taiwan. So today, my presentation will center on 3 major parts because I was told that I only have like 15 to 20 minutes. Hopefully I can address some of the questions. So first part, I will start by kind of defining the nature of this trade, wrestling, fictions, war, whatever you call it. And as Yun-Sun said, it's official now. It's a trade war. So I think there's a need to think more about it, the nature of this U.S. China trade wrestling. And then I'll follow this concept by portraying some of the potential impact it might have on Taiwan. Because I represent Taiwan, I can only address the impact on Taiwan part. Now let Troy discuss about the Korean issues. And I'll wrap up my presentation by introducing some of the countermeasures, counter strategies from Taiwan government and TAITRA, of course. Just put it very shortly, I see this trade war as merely just trade war. It goes beyond just trade frictions. It has a lot to do with the competition for future technology, supremacy, superiority, and also dominations. As some of the tariff increase announcement made by the Trump administration kind of focus primarily on the what we call the Made in China 2025 sectors, robotic, information technologies, aerospace, cybersecurity, clean energy, you name it. Those are the one of the key national agenda unveiled by President Xi Jinping in the 19th Party Congress. And the Chinese have step-by-step agenda to achieve that goal. So I tend to see this as merely just normal trade fictions, but it's it's competition for future work, especially in those advanced, innovative technology sectors. People who surrounded President Trump, well, a lot of people said that President Trump is the only person make decision, but I can see that it's been more than 1.5 years after he took office. There has been a lot of exchange of rhetorics and handshaking meeting between President Trump and his Chinese counterpart, Mr. Xi Jinping. I think President Trump finally get to understand that it's the Chinese side doesn't have much intention and willingness to make concession to address the trade dispute with Washington. So I think it explains why President Trump decided to launch this trade war against his Chinese counterparts by introducing a series of tariff increasing, as Yun-Sun pointed out earlier. So I think Washington see the U.S. China competition on technology as an issue of economic and national security. Okay, and of course there's always this domestic elements coming up, this upcoming midterm elections, and also 2 years from now, President Trump will have his re-election bid. So I think all in all, it involves both domestic elements, national security elements, and trade elements. So I would suggest we look at this trade war from a larger strategic context, rather just focus primarily on trade. Of course, Beijing knows about President Trump's intentions. So as Yun-Sun mentioned, Beijing's retaliations against President Trump's tariff increase kind of in the same scale and intensities, and target primarily on President Trump's supporting bases, those agricultural states. But I think I've been here to DC 2 days. I talked to some of the people from the administration or close to the administration. I got the impression that I think President Trump and some of his policy staff know that this will be a long battlefield, and they know that Beijing has targeted on some of the agricultural states, and I think President Trump and his policy advisors knows how to sort of engage in those agricultural people and reassuring that this is not just about their pocket, it's also about the longer-term national security goal of the United States. So if you look at the national security strategy introduced by the Trump administration December last year, it clearly defined China as strategic competitors, okay? And then, so everything follow that. There has been a clear policy direction that this competition between Washington and Beijing is not just on trade, but also security and also Korean Peninsula, South China Sea in the future. So I would, from the perspective of Taiwan side, I would recommend it Taiwan's decision makers to look at this issue not just from the trade or economic perspective, but rather in the bigger strategic field. Who will be the winner? Who will be the loser? It's hard to define. I mean, there's no clear winner from this battle. There will definitely be some losers. But I was, and the biggest challenge is that I see no space for both Washington and Beijing to back off. President Trump he believes that he's a smart negotiator. He's a top negotiator. And some of the so-called concession made by the Chinese side in reaction to President Trump's call was seen by President Trump as symbolic. That's why he put more bargain chip in that. And but if you look at, I think what lies behind President Trump's strategic thinking, my own take is that I think U.S. economy is relatively good. Unemployment rate is the historical low in the past 18 years. And if you look at the Chinese economic pictures, China's economy has been slowing down for quite some time. this potential debt crisis has been worsening. Not to mention that renminbi has been devaluated. So I think both leaders are very clear about their own domestic and economic situations, and both leaders believe that time is on their side. Both leaders believe that it's a chicken game, So whoever can stay longer, pretend longer, will win these ultimate games. So we will see. It's really hard to predict who is the winner and who is the loser from this game. Second part, impact on Taiwan. The current Taiwan government's position, I would say, it's just to use the one term: don't panic, but get ready for it. Okay, it's very easy to fan the flame about this potential war. Yes, indeed, from longer term, if President Trump add a few more additional 200 billion tariff on China, of course, the whole world will be entangled into this trade war. But from Taiwan's side, from TAITRA side, the organization I represent, also the Ministry of Economic of Taiwan government, we have done a very thorough, comprehensive investigation about the downsides and also possible impact this trade war might have on Taiwan, especially on those Taiwanese companies who have been running their business in mainland China. Taiwan's exports, Taiwan's economy depend heavily on Chinese market, no doubt about it. 40% of Taiwan's export all goes to China. But what we have seen in the past few years, I would say, there are more and more concerns from the Taiwanese company that it's become more and more difficult to do business in China for several reasons: rising labor wages, stricter rules, uncertainty of the policy from the central governments. For example, President Xi Jinping addressed this issue of pollution in the 19th Party Congress. That affect a lot of Taiwanese companies. So we have received a lot of requests from Taiwanese companies that they are facing a dilemma. So they got two choices. One is to move back to Taiwan and seek help from Taiwanese government. The other one is to strategically thinking about relocating their company, their business to ASEAN countries like Vietnam or Indonesia. So this has been going on for quite some years. And Taiwan is not the only country thinking about pivoting to the south. The Koreans have been doing this, so are the Japanese. The Indians are acting east. I was in Australia 2 weeks ago. The Australians are moving north. So we have seen more of a convergence of trade, economic, investment, even security, cooperation, and competition in those emerging markets like ASEAN and South Asia. So Taiwan is not the only country that has been pursuing the diversification strategies. Everybody knows that don't put all eggs in one aspect and in one basket. The Taiwanese knows about this very well. Koreans knows about this very well. So we have conducted we've conducted two surveys on this issue. The first one was made in late March when President Trump first announced this tariff increase on the Chinese items of steel and aluminum. And then we send out surveys to more than 200 Taiwanese companies in all major cities in China. And we conducted telephone conversation with almost 50 companies. We asked them about, do you feel the earthquake? Do you sense the shock? The response we got mostly are that they don't sense it. Some of them said that they do made a lot of mechanic equipment and also smartphone devices, but most of their products are mainly for Chinese domestic consumption. So they don't feel the impact. And the good news for Taiwan is that, of course, Taiwan produced the world's largest amount of cell phone devices and also laptops. Those two main items so far have not been included, even in the latest announcement of 200 billion tariff increase, those over 6,000 items. We have done a very thorough survey of every items that announced by the Trump administration. So those are good news, but of course we cannot just simply have this kind of wishful thinking because, like I said, the war is going on. And some Taiwanese company even came up with some positive response. They said that they've already know that they should avoid this future competition, trade competition between U.S. and China. So some of the Taiwanese companies have already opened up their alternative office in Vietnam and Indonesia. So in fact, this trade war provide more orders and contracts for them directly from the United States market. So for them, they have already adopted hedging strategies. Okay, they still maintain their operation in mainland China market, but they have their own alternative market in Vietnam, Indonesia, and even Cambodia. But I'm not saying that every Taiwanese companies can escape from this turmoil. I'm just using some cases to highlight that, yes, there has been a growing worries and anxieties. For example, for some of the Taiwanese companies that we interviewed, when we asked them, do you feel the shock? They said that, well, the government of Taiwan should told us, to tell us what kind of a preparation that we should do for that, right? For them, honestly, they're just doing their own business. They have no idea whether the end product will reproduce in China and re-export to the United States, and which, under this tariff competition, their product and their business will be hit severely. They have no clear understanding about that. So our Ministry of Economics, together with TAITRA, starting 2 days ago, have introduced another wave of investigation to the Taiwanese companies who are running their business in mainland China market right now. So more public hearings, more seminars, more surveys will be conducted by Taiwanese government and also TAITRA. TAITRA has 61 offices in the world, including 10 in mainland China. So our colleagues in mainland China in 10 cities have started all this kind of investigation and surveys. The latest report we received from our Chengdu office, because they talked to some of Taiwanese businessmen association in SHIH-CHUNG province, they told us that it might take another 3 to 6 months to really assess the impact of this trade, the latest round of trade wars. So my advice is that, of course, we should be on full alert. I'm sure Taiwan governments have done everything they could to prepare for the worst case scenario from happening. Every country are doing the same thing. But before we do that, I think we should stop being too panicked about this, and we should conduct more comprehensive and down-to-earth surveys about individual sectors to what extent will they be hit by these trade wars. So we will keep watching that. Finally, every country needs a countermeasures, counter strategies. I think Taiwan governments already realized that, not because of a U.S. China trade war, but from a strategic point of view, Taiwan government 2 years ago has already introduced this new policy of moving south. The official title is New Southbound Policies. So there are 18 countries under this new southbound policy umbrella, 10 ASEAN countries, 6 South Asia countries, plus Australia and New Zealand. I would say half of those 18 new southbound policy countries have expressed tremendous interest in doing business with Taiwan. Because like I said, India, for example, is very, very anxious in doing business with Taiwan, Korea, and other countries. Prime Minister Modi pledged to, for example, to set up 100 smart cities in India. And given the potential market of India and also populations, through TAITRA's efforts in the past 6 months, we have already matched 2 major joint ventures between Taiwan and India. One touches upon electric vehicle. The other one touches upon the joint ventures to open up a new petrochemical complex in Gujarat, the hometown of Prime Minister Modi. Indonesians, Vietnamese, Malaysian, Thailand have all working very closely with Taiwan side to further development, trade and development and investment opportunities. When I was in Canberra 2 weeks ago, the Australian government was about to unveil their so-called India strategies. So I think what Taiwan faces is more than just a possible impact from U.S. China trade, but also competition from Korean company, Japanese company, now Australian company. So when President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan first announced this new southbound policies, it has multiple strategic goals. One is, of course, to step by step pivot or help Taiwanese company pivot to other alternative markets, those 18 new southbound policy area countries. Another one is to make sure that we don't put all eggs in one basket. So good news is, since Taiwan has already done this kind of pivoting, so far, some of the Taiwanese company haven't really impacted by the trade war yet. But like I say, we should be very careful about the future development, given the fact that, as I said in the early beginning of my presentation, this competition between China and the United States is not just about trade. It also has national security elements. So whether it is a trade war or deal, hopefully there will be a deal. But I think don't panic, but get ready for it. So let me stop here. I welcome your comments and questions. Thank you.
Wow, please join me in thanking Chairman Liu. This is really comprehensive. This is the most comprehensive explanation of the potential impact and also Taiwan government's reaction or the countermeasures in light of this either a trade war or a deal. And it sounds like that if Taiwan comes out less dependent on the mainland China for economic development or for its operations and productions, it might be good news essentially. And before we go into the Q&A session, we also want to hear what is a Korean experience. What are the Koreans thinking about this trade war or potential deal? So Choi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me. When you look at this from the Korean perspective, I think this is something that started earlier. South Korea has been sort of feeling the impact on trade from the Trump administration from the very beginning. In essence, the only break that South Korea received was waiting until President Moon was elected, because South Korea went through the impeachment process with President Park Geun-hye, and so the Trump administration sort of focused its initial remarks or initial focus on Canada and Mexico by starting NAFTA up. But when we look at what the United States is doing on trade and where the Trump administration is, we often, the question I think is asked is like, is President Trump serious? Will they follow through on these things? And the way I like to try and think about this is, there is a statistician, Nate Silver, who wrote a book called The Signal and the Noise. And one of the things he talks about is that we often hear all this noise and everything, but we have to look for the signal which tells us what's really going on. And I think with President Trump, we get lots of noise, and we tend to listen to the noise. But I think we should really be focusing on the signal which President Trump does actually provide. And if you go back, and I mean, I'm not the first to say this, but to the 1980s, he's talked about how U.S. trade deals are unfair, other countries are taking and cheating us, and this has been a consistent pattern. Yeah. If you look at, the Chorus FTA, I mean, this is one of the things, until I actually did a research paper with a colleague of mine in Korea, that I think a lot of people didn't realize. His concern, or animus, however you want to describe it, with the Chorus FTA doesn't date to the election when he started talking about the Chorus FTA. He wrote a book, the subtitle of the book is Make America Great Again, in 2011, to where he actually has like 3 pages on why the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement is a bad deal for America. So, I mean, this isn't something that he, just came to for political reasons or whatever. These are long-held beliefs. And so if we look, what did President Trump say he would do in the campaign? Withdraw from TPP. Well, he's withdrawn from TPP. He would withdraw or renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement. He's done that. He said, you know what, I'm going to take and go after China. I'm going to place tariffs on Chinese goods. We're in the process of doing that. He raised the Chorus FTA. He didn't get specific. He said it's a horrible deal, but the administration has, renegotiated with South Korea. So if you kind of go down the list of the things, withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords, he's doing the things that he said he would do. And so I think we look at this we'll call it the highlight of the day or whatever, and we focus on that and we wonder, does he really mean it? Well, I think the reality is that he does. And, I've analyzed his tweets from the beginning of when he declared his campaign until he gave the State of the Union address. It's actually, there's a site.
You stayed up all night.
It's like Trump Twitter Tracker or something.com that actually makes it a lot easier because it has a good search engine. That's the problem with Twitter. Twitter's search engine is actually not really that good. But if you look at his tweets and you break it down by like keywords like trade, Mexico, and I did this looking at like Korea and North Korea and stuff. Yes, there's tweets there, but he tweets a whole lot more about Hillary, Russia, and all the other like witch hunt. I think I looked at as well. So he's giving out all this noise, these things that don't really relate to the policies. But every now and then he'll send out the policy one and everything, or a couple of them in a row. And so this is where we are. That he is following through. On what he has pledged. And so when you look at this from where South Korea is in this sort of uniquely awkward position in that, trade is a major issue, but North Korea is a major issue for both South Korea and the United States. And so, we talk about this as a trade war. And if we think about this, using, sticking with, the military terminology, in any war you have skirmishes or initial battles. And so the initial skirmishes or battles, I think, in this trade war were first the 201 safeguard measures on solar panels and washing machines. Now, technically these were filed under the Obama administration, but the Trump administration pushed them through. But if you go back and you look at a lot of the press, especially on the solar panel side, it was about this is in response to cheap Chinese solar panels. Interestingly, the largest exporter of solar panels to the United States was a South Korean company. South Korea is actually getting hit harder on this than China is. And so, the other thing about any battle is you always have innocent victims, if you will. And so South Korea was an initial casualty or initial victim of these actions. And so then if we move on to the 232, the National Security Investigation on steel and aluminum, South Korea doesn't really export much aluminum to the United States, but they were the #3 exporter of steel to the United States. And so ultimately, South Korea has in parallel to the negotiations on KORUS, cut a deal to take and basically place a quota where they'd only export 70% of their average exports over the last 3 years to the United States. They were the first country to cut a deal. They did this largely because one, you had the larger KORUS issue at play, so you want to take and try and pull these things off the table. Two, you had, at this point when a lot of this was going on, you had just ended a year to where North Korea had been highly belligerent. We had fire and fury. You had Rocket Man. You had, President Trump being called a dotard. All of these things going on, and there was, significant concern that, there might be a conflict. And then you had this sudden switch to a dialogue track. And so as the United States and South Korea started renegotiating the KORUS talks and the steel issue came up, the last thing, I think South Korea wanted was to have these economic issues flowing into this broader security issue. And so you're trying to pull this off the table. So we quickly moved forward on KORUS, and KORUS was a sort of limited, narrow scoping of change, and we can talk more about that if you'd like later on. You had, this steel issue taken off the table, and you sort of cleared the deck to move forward on the broader security implications or issues that were facing both countries. But now you have a much deeper issue, which is you have, one, the Section 301 investigation on intellectual property that, we've been talking about here, to where, now we're getting into these sort of astronomical type numbers of potential, amounts of goods that you'll have tariffs on. And two, you have also hanging out there, one, the already announced national security investigation on autos, another major South Korean export to the United States, and potentially other national security investigations. There's been floated the idea of semiconductors and other things. And so, when South Korea, looks at this, you have an issue of, okay, one, let's start with sort of the very narrow range issues of the new 232 on autos. Much of the talk on the CORSA-FA renegotiation was on autos trade between the United States and South Korea. So it is unclear at this point whether South Korea will be exempted from, should the administration decide that there is a national security implication for the importation of autos because we've now resolved this, or is it not? And if it's not, that then raises complications, I think, for the United States. South Korea was the first country to take and basically reach an agreement with the Trump administration. And if those agreements essentially become null and void because of future investigations, literally before the ink is dry, it raises the question of, well, can you negotiate an agreement with the Trump administration? South Korea demonstrated you could, and you could take and you could scope an agreement and you could do something to where all parties would be happy. But if that agreement is automatically unwound, you get a larger issue. And so you have these different political challenges at play here for both the South Korean side and the US side, I think. But if you then move now to, what this is about, we'll call it the broader war that is just now maybe beginning with China, South Korea is largely caught in the middle. So if we look at South Korean exports, the way I usually like to put this is, if you look at South Korea's trade between it and China, it is larger than its trade with the United States and the European Union, or the United States and Japan combined. It's their #1 trading partner. It's in a major economic hub for South Korea, and it's a major production platform for South Korea. Now, what this means, though, is, if you think about it, is South Korea is using China as part of its production networks. And we're not necessarily seeing this when you look at goods that are imported from China. And so if you look at it this way, 24% of South Koreans' exports go to China. 79% of those are intermediate goods. 27% of those are semiconductors. And semiconductors account for 21% of South Korean exports. So, Yoon had brought up this question of semiconductors initially and everything. This is a major issue. And when you look at semiconductors more broadly, there's different categories, and South Korea is largely in the memory category side of things. But if you look at those, that segment, 70% of those produced in the world are South Korean. Now, they're not all made in South Korea. We should be clear about that. There is a plant just outside of Austin, Texas, by Samsung that I've visited. That plant does not do final production. They're finished in South Korea. But let's say Samsung was thinking about, converting that plant to, final production in the United States. If we get to a point to where, the Chinese place tariffs on U.S. semiconductors, South Korean, or Samsung specifically, could not export, semiconductors to China to be put in the production of cell phones, TVs, or virtually any other mechanical item now, because everything, has these chips. And so now you get into this broader challenge, which is that, one of the things driving the Trump administration's policy is definitely a desire to ensure the United States maintains its technological lead, but it's also a desire to create jobs, to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. But if you're Samsung, or if you're a company who utilizes Samsung chip, which, let's be honest, that's a lot of companies in the world, or Hynix as well, there's now this more broader complication, which is, okay, any consumer good we produce in, North America, if NAFTA gets resolved, or if it doesn't get resolved, it's much more complicated, we can use from the Samsung plant in Austin. But if we're servicing the Chinese market now, or maybe other related markets that might be coming from China, like shipping to Europe, well, are we going to take and whatever percentage of the tariff the Chinese put on semiconductors, if that were to happen, raise the price, or are we going to import that from a South Korean plant based in South Korea, a Samsung plant to be based in South Korea, or will this incentivize Samsung to instead add additional capacity in China to produce semiconductors, which is the antithesis, essentially, of what the Trump administration is hoping to achieve. So you have these interconnecting pieces which you need to think through and see how they play out. And so if we think about how this impacts, South Korean firms or South Korea in general, it's not just, semiconductors. I was looking through some of the trade data before I came over. Some of the other major items are, equipment for flat panel production. Now, there is a, assembly plant for Samsung TVs in the U.S. as well. So once again, maybe there's a way around some of these issues. Things like optical readers. So, we're talking about a lot of high-tech equipment that's going to produce other items. And the reason South Korea has this large amount of intermediate trade with China is that if you look at final destination trade, which one of my colleagues in South Korea has done, and now the data is a few years old, but I think it's still relevant, essentially trade with China boils down in terms of its equality for a final destination as being roughly equal to trade with the European Union, with Japan, and the United States. So all of these four markets are roughly equally important to South Korea, but much of this trade is being assembled and finalized through China. So you have these connections. And so what does that then mean for the issue of how it affects South Korean economic growth? There's a study in 2015 that essentially a 1% increase in growth in China leads to a 0.3% increase in South Korea. So there's a fairly strong correlation there. If you then take and look at what most of the estimates have been recently for the impact on the South Korean economy, it's that if we see this play out to where you get the 200 billion in tariffs or maybe more, that we could see 0.3% shaved off South Korea's GDP growth this year. Now, this raises a question because these are things reported. I haven't had a chance to go through the specific reports, whether they're still using this estimate of the correlation or separately. So that could also then mean that they're expecting Chinese growth to drop by 1% this year. But China is a large market for South Korea, both as a production platform and for sales. And so if you have a decrease of demand in China, either because companies now can't export goods to the United States or because you have decreased domestic consumption in China, that then starts flowing back into the South Korean economy. Now, how does this tie into, Chairman Liu was talking about, the broader security aspect and everything. And there's two parts of this that I want to talk about. One is essentially, and I know, in DC, perhaps it's passé to talk about why a rules-based system is important these days and everything. But if we look at the experience of South Korea and its security relationship with the United States and its economic relationship with China, you have the experience over the last year and a half or so of the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system. Now, in a technical sense, because China has never said that they're specifically retaliating against South Korean companies, there's not retaliation going on. That being said, if you look at what they've done, there are some things that you can see if you look at the data that are clearly THAAD related, because tourists don't just suddenly stop going to South Korea on a specific date, if there's not something else at play. But there are other areas that we know, like if you look, there has been a drop in, for example, the sale of Hyundais and Kias in China. Yeah. This is harder to disaggregate. The drop happens around the time that happens, which, as a colleague of mine said, they'd love to know how the Chinese convinced people not to buy South Korean vehicles all at the same time. But you have to be somewhat skeptical of the drop too, because for the year prior to that, South Korean sales of autos had been declining in China anyways, and their product mix was sort of out of fashion in the Chinese market. So was that playing a role in this? Probably yes. Was it as large a role as it may look like? Probably not, because there's other reasons. So the reason I raise this is, when you look at what the Chinese did, they were trying to pressure the South Korean government to not deploy THAAD or to reverse the deployment. And by doing this, they were essentially going into areas to where, if you look at what they targeted, be it like tourism or things in the services sector, they were areas where essentially there wasn't a good retaliatory measure for South Korea because they either weren't covered under WTO rules or they weren't covered under the South Korea-China FTA. So there wasn't a mechanism in place for the South Koreans to say, you know, you can't take and do this, therefore we're going to take you to a dispute settlement mechanism, and then that would allow us to take and retaliate you to a certain amount. Now, in our current era, and this is the reason I raise this, to where the United States is now using this idea of national security exemption, what China might do in a new era is say, this is a violation of our national security, so therefore, you know, we can do this. And the more you use these things and the looser they get, the more you get into arbitrary type decisions that can have impact on real national security issues. What types of, you know, forces are deployed where? Do governments use economic means to strong-arm countries on security measures? And essentially, you know, my concern is that in going down the path the United States is going, we're sort of legitimizing the tactics that China has sort of discreetly been trying to use to an extent. And so we have to keep that in mind, that, you know, even if, and, you know, I would completely agree with the Trump administration that the intellectual property issues, the issues in terms of being able to sell freely in the Chinese market are real and we need to address them. It's a question of the tools that one uses to address those issues as opposed to whether the issues are legitimate and should be addressed. The other, which I want to get into is, and, you know, Yoon had taken and, you know, sort of, you know, briefly touched on this as well, is the issue of North Korea and how this all plays out. So you have a situation to where President Trump, early on in his administration, and there's a tweet with this, and I think he said it in a press conference as well, but I know there's the tweet, that, you know, if Xi Jinping gives me a good deal or helps me with North Korea, I'll give him a good deal on trade. If I'm sitting in Beijing right now, I'm wondering if this really looks like a good deal for me. So you have this sort of implicit understanding that President Trump had put out, and which now seems to be, you know, going against. And so whether we've seen so far, you know, China has suggested perhaps it's time to lift sanctions on North Korea now that we're back in talks. You have, you know, this evidence that perhaps the Chinese aren't enforcing sanctions as vigorously as before. Whether that's, you know, in direct response to the United States trade actions, or whether that is more a function of that, you know, China's preferred method was never to take and place tariffs on North Korea, but the North Koreans really didn't give them much of a choice with their, you know, actions. And so this is China simply resorting back to, we'll say, a preferred policy preference. You know, we can debate, you know, the causality there. But the difficulty is if the denuclearization of North Korea is a priority of the United States, and, you know, in terms that I think, you know, President Trump would understand, you want to maintain leverage with, you know, Beijing to ensure that they are taking and, you know, maintaining tight enforcement of sanctions. And if the talks break down, that, you know, they take and increase the economic pressure on Pyongyang, well, you know, there are strategic reasons why the Chinese would not want the North Koreans to have nuclear weapons. But you start getting into domestic politics when you, one, start mixing issues, and two, start going down the road going. One, how much political space does Xi Jinping have to hold the line on North Korea if the United States is, you know, significantly going after the Chinese economy? Two, even if he can hold the line and do that, you know, you get to this issue of what real leverage does the United States have left? You know, like, the estimates is that if we follow through on all the potential threatened tariffs on China, it would reach 450, you know, billion in Chinese exports to the United States. China, if I remember correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think exported something like 530 billion to the United States last year. Yeah. If you are going to try and apply pressure on China, to apply pressure on North Korea, you need a means to do that. Historically, you know, we've talked about maybe going after the Chinese banks that, you know, perhaps are facilitating some of this trade. But at some point, if most of your exports to the United States are, you know, under additional tariffs, does another 10 billion in tariffs on Chinese exports, or does a certain amount of fines on Chinese banks really end up mattering when you're talking about broader foreign security policy? So in some ways, we've taken and we're slowly unwinding the leverage we might have if China didn't actually want to follow through and continue enforcing sanctions. And there's a path that I could see to where we could get to that point, which is, you know, we could get to a phase to where we're just muddling through with North Korea. They're not taking and testing missiles anymore. They don't test a nuclear weapon, but we're not really making progress. And then it gets into sort of a he said, she said, if you will, on, you know, who's at fault and all these other things. But if the North Koreans are largely behaving, how do you convince the Chinese then to take and go the extra mile on sanctions? Especially if maybe it looks like the United States is maybe the one being unreasonable, potentially, depending on how it plays out. So, you know, all of these issues start converging, and they converge in a way that might not be, you know, beneficial. And so, you know, if you're South Korea, well, one, you want to see the process with North Korea go forward. You know, there's significant implications. You don't want to get back to a point to where the process breaks down. The United States isn't able to keep Beijing on board to take and, you know, put additional pressure on North Korea, and so then decides to return to perhaps a military option. And so, you know, from a South Korean perspective, you know, this trade war with China has potential implications that are bad for it from an economic perspective, but aren't exactly good for it from a security perspective either. But, you know, I think you're going to see the South Korean government continue to try to work with the Trump administration because they do have these large equities. And so just like you took and you tried to reach a deal on Chorus, you're going to try to take and work with them to manage these other, you know, potential challenges down the road as well.
Well, with that positive note, well, that is, okay, kind of gloomy. I thought it would be bad, but this is really pretty bad. So I want to follow up for with a question for both of you that has something to do with China's economic statecraft. Joy mentioned about this, that how China uses economic means to strong arm other countries into doing things that they want. And then we know that in the case of Taiwan, one of the policy initiatives since from mainland is this 31 measures, try to appeal to the Taiwan businesses and the Taiwan public. Now with this trade war with the United States, and with the potential ramification for both the Taiwanese companies in mainland and the South Korean companies in China, do you see that the Chinese government will come up with some measures to offset the impact for Taiwanese companies, for the South Korean companies? Because like you pointed out, there's a bigger fish here that China wants to entice or wants to appeal to the Taiwanese business community. And China wants to shape South Korea's strategic alignment choices for the future. So since the mainland understand that that there is going to be that impact for both Taiwan and South Korea, do you see that they will come up with some economic statecraft to manipulate the situation?
Well, I think it's too early to see whether these two scenarios will kind of intertwine with each other. On the most recent so-called economic incentives introduced by China to Taiwan, it was more of a typical sort of a soft power approach toward Taiwan, with the aim of winning the hearts or minds of Taiwanese people. But I think it's not surprising to me that Chinese have adopted two-hand strategy on Taiwan. On the one hand, they keep shutting the door with the official DPP government, but on the other hand, they opens up more doors to sort of attract the young Taiwanese entrepreneurs, professional scholars, doctors. They provide better salaries, better working environment for them. I was talking to one of the young startup company boss. He said he's going to Shenzhen to open up his startup companies. I asked him, aren't you afraid of being sort of monitored by the Chinese every day? He said, no, he will just go there and hopefully make money. A few years later, he will come back. You know. Well, I'm not saying that, well, again, this is the typical divide and conquer strategy that Chinese have been embarking on Taiwan people. But throughout the years, I think there has been more and more consciousness within Taiwanese society that, yes, they love to do business in China. They love to pursue advanced graduate studies in Fudan Daxue or Beijing University or Tsinghua University. But when it comes to national identity or perception of themselves as Taiwanese or Chinese, I think there has been more and more polling showing that this Taiwanese identity keep getting stronger and stronger, even under the former Kuomintang administration. So I think especially for the younger generation of Taiwanese, I'm talking about younger generation under the age of 30s, they get to know more about the Chinese society. They know there are a lot of risks behind doing business in China, but they still wanted to give a shot, But going back to your second question, whether Chinese gonna use this ongoing trade war with Washington and turn that into some kind of advanced economic leverage or incentive on Taiwan, on Koreans, so far I don't see the clear linkage yet. As I pointed out earlier, most Taiwanese companies that might be hampered by this trade war have been doing their business in China for more than 2 decades. And as I said, there's a need to specifically dissect which sector will be impacted by this trade war and which sector will instead benefit by this trade war. Like, for example, 80% of a Taiwanese company in China are producing what we call intermediate goods. They have no idea whether the ultimate goods are mainly for Chinese domestic consumption or being reproduced and exported to the United States market. All they care about is making money, So the Taiwan government's responsibility is, of course, hopefully Beijing government can resume official dialogue with Taiwan. So in case there are some commercial dispute or anything happen to Taiwanese businessmen in China, through either government channel or semi-government channel between SAF and ARAS, we can fix things for Taiwanese people and their Chinese associates. So I don't see the clear linkage between China's political intention to win hearts and minds of Taiwanese people vis-a-vis China wanted to use Taiwanese businessmen as some kind of leverage to counteract President Trump's trade wars. Because otherwise, China would have to talk to Taiwanese side, official side, to hopefully set up a united front, but which would be good, All Taiwanese government want is to resume official dialogue. We'll be open to discuss how to jointly handle potential impact of this U.S. China trade war and how to make sure Taiwanese businessmen, their business and their operation in mainland China can avoid being further sabotaged by the trade war. But as long as Chinese are wanting to resume official dialogue, I think there's no problem with Taiwan government.
I think that's a very good point. So maintain the principled position. If the Chinese really want to talk to Taiwan about the ramification of the trade war, then they better restart the official communication.
Yes. And
Choi?
So for South Korea, it's interesting. I think this is right, that it's probably too early, especially if we're talking about like financial incentives. But, at the moment, South Korea and China are negotiating the investment and services portion of their FTA because they just did the goods side before. And the Korea-China FTA on the goods side, it was better than some other Chinese FTAs, but it wasn't up to the standard of the Chorus FTA or Korea's FTA with the EU. So it'll be interesting to see if perhaps one of the incentives China tries to do is to maybe do specifically, I would think, on the investment side, to provide more protections for South Korean companies than perhaps they have in other trade agreements. And so that might be one thing to look at, I think, going forward, to sort of see how that plays out and if the Chinese try to maybe induce more investment in China by South Korean companies that way. But in terms of financial inducements, my guess is that, if it happens, it'll probably be for only in strategic sectors, specifically ones that might help advance the Made in China 25 sector. But I think that's still probably, down the road.
Yeah, and we know which directions that leads to.
Yeah.
Well, great. With that, we will open the floor for Q&A. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Please identify yourself, and please do not make a super long statement, and focus on the questions since we have the two important speakers here. Okay, so the gentleman over there.
Hello, my name is Drake Long. I'm with the Global Taiwan Institute. So ostensibly, the current trade war is about the trade deficit, but it's more so looking at the Made in China 2025 plan. Considering that Taiwan and South Korea both are targeting the same industries as Made in China 2025, just simply under different names, such as the 5+2 plan, I want to know if there is a concern that after the current administration sets its eyes on China, if down the line, Taiwan and South Korea or another economy might be the next target, especially given the current administration's status towards trade, chorus, and how long-living those sorts of attitudes could be after this administration. This is for any one of the panelists. Thank you.
Is it possible, next target? Taiwan or South Korea?
Oh, I think, again, you need to look specifically on most sectors that Chinese companies are running in the Chinese market. With respect to those advanced technologies, like AI, IoT, or robotic, I think, of course, those are the key national agenda introduced by the Taiwan government at this moment. But I think most of those those technological innovation in the sectors are not entirely operating in the Chinese market yet. And we encourage them, again, with the aim of a diversification, we encourage them to look for other alternative market. And as a trade promotion agency, Taiwan would love to introduce them to other countries, even to some some European countries too, or Australians. So, to give you some examples. Earlier this year, Facebook and Microsoft, Google, all decided to open up their AI real R&D center in Taiwan, not in China. Why? Well, I don't need to tell you the answers. They see the potential of Taiwan's young people in those fields, in AI and others, VR, AR, just name it. So I think at this moment, I personally feel that it gives Taiwan a tremendous good opportunity to rebrand itself. And of course, the Taiwanese government right now has been pretty much preoccupied with those 2+2 industries, which includes biotech or Asian Silicon Valley, green energy, smart agriculture, circular economy, defense industry, you name it. Those are the key engines for Taiwan's future economy. And the Taiwan side have already overlooked that. And we try to bring all those technology to the world. And hopefully we can bring more multinational company in those areas to Taiwan to either set up R&D center or to run serious business with Taiwan. Another good example is that because this has been a deal in Taiwan. That is, the current Taiwan government decided to put more resources in the renewable energies because the government of Taiwan has set this deadline 2025 as to phase out nuclear power. So we need to develop renewable energies. So recently a deal has been made, and several European companies and Canadian company and Australian company are all joined for that contract. That is to deploy offshore windmills outside central Taiwan, because they know that Taiwan government are serious about renewable energies. So I think first you need to show the world that you are serious about those kind of technology and sectors, and then come up with some kind of a market opening and regulation adjustment, then the investor will come.
So I think we need to watch the 232 process going forward. And I think this autos process specifically is going to be telling. I think it's really hard. I mean, if you look at it, the U.S. auto industry's profit margins are up You know, it's a healthy industry right now. I don't think, if we're being honest, that there is a good national security argument for tariffs on the importation of vehicles in the United States. That being said, you know, if the report finds that, I think a lot of these other issues kind of start withering away and we move to, you know, more market-based competition. But if it comes back, and specifically it comes back fairly quickly, that, you know, it does undermine U.S. national security, I think then we get into a situation where it's not that Taiwan, South Korea, or any specific country may be targeted specifically, but that certain industries that the administration wants to target, you know, they've talked about wanting to have more semiconductor production in the United States. You know, then I think you run the risk of that, you know, then we have these investigations to where we kind of all know where the outcome's going to come. And so then I think what you start seeing is companies having to make the decision of whether they live with the tariffs or redeploy where they produce things. And some of that will depend, like I said, on how, you know, NAFTA plays out and if there's exemptions for these things in NAFTA or whatnot.
The gentleman over here.
Hi, Tiger Roach with the Mongolia Tomorrow Coalition. Now, Mongolia is China's largest neighbor. 1/3 of Chinese foreign direct investment makes up Mongolia's total foreign direct investment. Mongolia sees the United States as its third neighbor, and it's a robust democracy. Now, the administration is very committed to reducing its trade deficit. What can Washington do to reduce overall, reduce China's neighbors' overall reliance on Beijing?
What can U.S. do to reduce? That's not
That's
directly
beyond.
related to the
Beyond.
topic today. Maybe we can talk after the session.
Yeah, sorry.
The lady over here.
So I have two questions.
Please identify yourself.
Okay, sorry. Jiaxing Wei from the China Press. I'm a journalist. I have two questions. The first one is about, because our topic is specifically focused on the Asian economies. So my first question is about what would be an effective strategy for the Asian countries to work together, you know, in response to the this trade war? Because I think although China is the only target right now, no economies will be exempt from this trade war. So there should be a very, you know, well-negotiated strategy developing in order to respond to this trade war. And my second question is specifically focused on the American domestic politics. I see a paradox here. On the one hand, Trump is trying to fulfill his promise that he made along campaign line that he's going to take back the jobs you know, stolen by China. But on the other hand, I think those farmers or the small producers in the Midwest will probably feel the pain very soon. So I think they are the people who will get hurt from this trade war. So I think Trump is definitely, you know, doing some political calculations here. And how do you think? So I would like some, you know, opinions from three experts. Trump, how is this, you know, trade war is gonna project it or influence the midterm in November, and also a long term? I mean, the 2020 presidential election. Thank you.
I want to say that the second question is probably more for a U.S. expert, not.
Well, I mean, I used to work in politics, so I
That's
can.
right. More on the Hill.
Yeah. Well, I guess to the first one, what I would say is, I mean, the trade war doesn't just encompass China. I mean, I would argue that if you're talking to the Europeans, they would probably say that, you know, they're in a trade war with the United States. You know, Canada and Mexico, I'm sure, would probably argue that they're in a trade war with the United States. So China may be the biggest fish, if you will, in this. But, I mean, I think, you know, and I was actually thinking on the way over, like, should we call it a conflict rather than a war? I mean, war is kind of the, you know, term that we use. But I think, you know, whether you call it a trade war, whether you say it's U.S. trade actions against, you know, countries engaging in unfair trade practices, This is encompassing a much larger group of countries than just China. China is just the one that we focus on and that, the Trump administration is kind of focusing on a lot. In terms to how does this play out politically, I mean, there's a couple different factors. One is Anthony Kennedy, to be honest with you. How is this Supreme Court nomination going to change sort of the politics, in the lead up to the election? If Kavanaugh is fairly easily confirmed, does that then take and dissipate the desire maybe of, conservative voters who see the issues that might be dealt with by the Supreme Court as a primary voting reason to maybe stay home because they're like, all right, Kavanaugh got through, we have this, the court is now right-leaning, and, we don't have to worry about this. If that happens one way or the other, that drive out more Democratic voters or more centrist voters to vote against Republican candidates? So you have this issue at play that can maybe counterbalance the negative side of the trade issue. If you look at this based on each branch of government, it's a trickier calculation in the Senate because the Senate has to confirm a Supreme Court nominee. So, farmers in Montana, where John Tester is running for re-election, might decide that, they're not happy losing their business with China, but they might decide that, well, the trade war might end soon, and so therefore the Supreme Court nomination is more important. And Tester if he votes against Kavanaugh, we need to get rid of, Tester, so that way we have somebody who would vote more in line with that. So I think the Senate, the calculation is a little more difficult. In some ways, this is the best of both worlds for House Democrats because they can campaign really hard against Kavanaugh to try and drive out the vote, and there's zero consequence because they don't have to vote for him. At the same time, you have a lot of farmers who are going to get hit, and people in other industries, manufacturing. If you look at, so there was a story I was reading, I forget what they produce, but there's this one company that now is basically trying to run its operations without the lights on to save money because of the tariff increases on, steel. And, all of this is going to start flowing back into the economy. And so the question becomes, and I think it was actually James Carville who coined this, but Clinton said it, it's the economy, stupid. And if people are losing jobs, if companies are seeing their prospects decline, if the U.S. economy is slowing, and it's all because not, the business cycle or something, but specific actions the administration took and is refusing to reverse, I think that's bad if you're a Republican running for Congress. And I think that's why you saw in the Senate, basically 88 members vote to take and basically, in a non-binding resolution, yes, but to send a signal that they think the administration needs to listen to Congress more. And let's be honest, this is a congressional power that's been delegated to the administration. This is not an administration power. So you have that factor at play as well. And I think you also have that this is a year to where you're going to have some interesting races. I'm from Tennessee. There's, at least sort of initial anecdotal evidence that a lot of farmers are upset. Phil Bredesen, the former governor who's a Democrat, is running, is seen as a centrist. He's a former businessman. This is the type of person, if Democrats nominate in other states, that might be able to win. And so I think there's a lot of, on the political side, perilous, prospects for this going forward. That being said, there is one caveat I think we should keep in mind. Politics in the United States has become very partisan, and how much will that partisanship override the economic aspect of it? Meaning, I don't like President Trump's trade policies, but he's my guy, and I'm going to vote against Democrats because I vote against Democrats now, rather than what had been more sort of policy-based voting, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. In terms of his reelection, that's about 8 political lifetimes from now, so it's really much harder to say.
That is hard to say.
Well, just to answer your first question, because Troy has already explained the second question in a very good way. I think Taiwan Taiwan serves as a very unique case. Even without the current ongoing U.S. China trade war, Taiwan government has already decided to diversify its trade or foreign outreach. So this concept of moving south, based entirely on two strategic thinking. One is, of course, to step by step, decrease the over dependence on Chinese market. We still wanted to do business with the Chinese, but like I said, we don't want to put all eggs in one basket, with or without U.S. China trade war. So this idea of pivoting to the south, to ASEAN, to South Asian countries, because we know that there are potential market there. They are the younger generation. They have plenty of consumers and purchasing power. So, and like I said earlier, Taiwan is not the only country who has eyes on that huge potential market. Koreans are number one export countries to Vietnam. Taiwan used to be number one 6 years ago. Now Taiwan is like number 4, number 5. If you go into Vietnam, those young Vietnamese, their life is full of Koreans, Korean culture, Korean pop song, you know. That's why. Well, even that, President Moon, last year when he visited Indonesia, still make it official that Korea wanted to pursue, again, a southbound policy by focusing more, not just on trade and investment, but also people-to-people engagement. The Taiwan government, Taiwan's president introduced that policy a year before South Korean president. So what I'm trying to say is that, but because Taiwan, when it comes to trade, there's always this ultimate political obstacles lying ahead of Taiwan's relationship with other countries. But having said that, I think what Taiwan wanted to do is to, first of all, do a bit of a structural reform at home, open up our market, revise all those outdated laws as a way to show the world, show the region that Taiwan is well qualified for CPTPP or RCEP or bilateral FTA negotiation. You know, we have to make that first step to convince our potential partner that even without the Chinese interference, Taiwan is ready for that. All right. So even if the Chinese factor is still obstruct Taiwan from signing more FTAs with other countries or join regional trade regimes, still Taiwan can pursue individual trade and investment project with those ASEAN countries or South Asian countries, or to further deepen people-to-people engagement through cultural, educational, even science and technology exchanges. So I think in this regard, it's hard to, and plus Taiwan can, when everyone has their eyes in this emerging market, Taiwan can also look for other possibility of working with Japan and Korea to jointly explore market opportunity in those areas. In fact, Taiwan has already worked with our Japanese counterparts on selected sectors in those new southbound policy countries. Taitra's Japanese counterpart is JETRO, and our Korean counterpart is KOTRA. Our Australian counterpart is Austrade. We have engaged with them deeply to identify possible sectors that Taiwan can, or both of us can complement with each other without facing face-to-face competitions. So I think there's always a way out. It depends on whether you are serious about that, to explore every possible opportunities of cooperations.
Maybe we'll have time for one more question on this side. This lady over here.
Hello, I'm Elisa Gura, and I'm with the Program of Public Service at St. Albans. So as we've seen from this very lovely and informative panel, trade wars are messy. And as Mr. Stangarone mentioned, there are real concerns for the U.S. in terms of unfair trade practices in China, intellectual property theft, et cetera. So what do you suggest are better options for the U.S. to take that have less of a splash effect on U.S. allies in Eastern Asian economies?
So I was talking about this with a colleague of mine, and their response when I laid out a plan was that the current administration would have stopped listening at the words TPP. But, you know, what I would have suggested if I were in the administration at the beginning is, I think, one, you have to have priorities. What is your priority? If addressing Chinese intellectual property concerns and access to the Chinese market is the number one concern of the United States government, specifically on economic issues, then you go about building a policy that would take and address that. If it's, you know, restoring the steel industry in the United States, then, you know, that's the first thing you do. But these policies seem to sometimes overlap and contradict each other. So I think we should all acknowledge, I mean, I'm going to say something self-evident, China is the world's second largest economy. You know, this isn't, you know, dealing with, you know, say the world's 50th largest economy where the U.S. can go and say, you know, we want you to make a change, and they're going to say, you know, all right, we want to do this. Or to give a specific example, you know, the whole UN resolution recently on breastfeeding, to where, you know, we forced, what was it, I think Ecuador to withdraw it because we said we cut off aid. You know, I mean, you can't really do that with China, you know. So then the question becomes, how do you go about creating the leverage you need to convince the Chinese to make the changes you'd like to see? And so if you're going to do that, what I would have said is, you know, there's this grand tradition in the United States of we elect a new president, and the first thing they do is they go to our trading partner who's waiting for us to approve an FTA and say, I want a different FTA. You know, Bill Clinton did this, you know, with NAFTA. Obama did it with, you know, the 3 FTAs that President Bush left him. I would have said to President Trump, you don't like TPP? That's fine. We understand that. You know, what would you like to see in TPP to make it better? And the thing is at the very beginning of his administration, you know, most countries want to have a good relationship with the United States. Most countries have an economic and strategic interest in having a good relationship with the United States. There would have been a willingness on the TPP partners if it wasn't completely and totally outlandish change to take and revise TPP. So I would have said, get a TPP you can be happy with, start putting in place the rules in the region that would prohibit those practices which you do not like in the Chinese economy. So start building out that, you know, yes, you're doing this domestically in China, but as you start moving out of the world, this isn't going to be acceptable. Two.
Absolutely. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, as you say, then I would have buttressed it by finishing TTIP, basically extend these rules out, and then I would have built an international coalition with all the countries who have the same problems to go to the Chinese together without starting wars with the Europeans, the Japanese, and everyone else in the process.
And Chairman Liu, please.
Yeah, this is not a direct answer to your question, but I want to make some further clarification by what I just said earlier about whether China, to answer your question, whether China will team up with Taiwan and hopefully to address this trade war. What I'm suggesting is not Taiwan, you know, sort of work with Beijing to counteract the U.S. government. What I'm suggesting is that through the resumption of official dialogue, then both sides of Taiwan Strait can jointly seriously discuss how to protect those 2 million Taiwanese businessmen in their business in mainland China. So I'm not suggesting a kind of a united front strategy between Taiwan and China against the Trump administration. Just to make it clear. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully not. Well, with that, we conclude this very informative and very insightful discussion. Thank you for coming. Please join me in thanking our speakers, especially Chairman Liu.